Welcome to the slideshow. This is going to be an introduction to urbanization. Um, Now, urbanization for LXLA focuses on what the reasons for urbanization are, what the kind of trends there are, what the impacts of urbanization are in different kinds of countries, in different levels of development, as they might say. Um, and today we're going to have a look at why, okay, there is urbanization in different places and look at some of the trends and look at a world map about urbanization and learn some keywords. So the first slide just shows a kind of series of images. This is the New York skyline over a period of about 140 years. And as you can see, slowly the urban area has grown upwards as well as outwards. And now you can see it's much bigger than it used to be. Another example is this one. This is Toronto in Canada. You can kind of see the massive kind of urban sprawl that's happened over the course of about 75 years there. Um, and so urbanization, as we can imagine, is the essentially the increased proportion of people living in towns and cities. So that's probably represented in a percentage usually. So you might say, 55% of the population live in urban areas and 46 live in rural areas. Now, if that goes up to say 56%, then that will count as urbanization. So it's an increased proportion of people living in towns and cities. So proportion is kind of like in proportion to something else. So it's kind of looking at a change in. So yeah, this is the key terms. This is what we need to know. You might be asked to define this key term in the exam. So in that sense, you really need to know what it is. So maybe here's a chance to write it down. I'll give you about 5-10 seconds, and I'll move on. So what I'm showing you here is a map of the world showing urban population. Now you can use this kind of the scheme on the left to describe it, and we always want to understand from a map what the trend is. Are there any anomalies? Okay, and you need to be able to extract information from there to kind of use in the exam. So for instance, I would start off with some trends. Okay, so you can see that North America, South America, and Europe all have very high rates of urbanization of around 62% plus, whereas if you look at Africa, South and Eastern Asia, um, we have mainly got rates of about 28 to about 62%. Okay, um, some anomalies are obviously Northern Africa. I think that's Algeria and Libya. And those two have rates of about 62 to 81%. And in the Middle East as well, as you can see, Saudi Arabia has a very, very high proportion of people living in urban areas. Now, the general trend, in fact, is that the more wealthier countries have higher rates of urban populations. However, as we'll see in a bit, the trends are changing, and that won't be the case over the next 30 or so years. Other continents and kind of less economically developed countries, in a sense, are going to catch up as they're urbanizing very, very quickly. But as you can currently see, there is a kind of strong correlation between level of development and urbanization. There is one country in Africa that has an extremely high rate of urbanization as well. In fact, two. So obviously there are anomalies, and you always should be able to say what an anomaly is when you're describing the data. So where it is and why it's an anomaly. But always remember to use data with any response you do in the exams. So have a go if you want to pause the slideshow and just have a go at describing the distribution of the world's urban population. That would be great. Focus on the trends, which places have the highest urban populations, how much. If you can give some country examples, that's even better, to show off your kind of knowledge of world geography in that sense. And then any trends, the opposite trends, so which places. So you might want to say along the equator we have countries with low urban populations. South Asia, so it's Pakistan there. Um, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, places like that, Cambodia, Vietnam, um, and then I believe it's Indonesia in the kind of Australasia region as well. Obviously, Australia is a very, very highly developed country, and therefore it tends to go with the trend and have a very high population. So have a go at this, and then we're going to move on. So this is a bar chart, and obviously it kind of flows over time. Um, in the corner it says challenge. Why is this an appropriate method to present this data? Now, it's an appropriate method because you can compare different areas around the world over time, um, and it can show change, and therefore it does work really well. You could also um, potentially put this data as line graphs, but it may not look as clear if lots of lines are kind of crossing through each other. Um, this allows a kind of a very clear way of comparing and showing kind of a trend. So that's why it's a really good method. Now this is a predicted growth in urban population. So it goes from 1950 all the way to 2030 and looks at different regions of the world. Now we need to understand the different trends that are happening. So if you want to, you can pick out key bits of data. You can see that the North America, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Oceania tend to have the highest amounts of population. As we said earlier, it tends to go with more highly developed countries, and therefore we can see that trend clearly there. But as we can see, Africa and Asia are going to experience vast amounts of urbanization, and by 2030, in fact, the major trend is that most regions of the world will have urban populations of over 50%, which is incredible. So that's an important trend. You can also see that developing countries are going to urbanize the most over the next 30 years as they become more and more developed, economically developed over time. And this is mainly because people will be moving to cities to find work, maybe because populations are getting bigger, or there's more jobs available in urban areas, and that's why those regions are going to grow. So you can definitely see some trends, and potentially no surprises here. It's just a general trend of everywhere getting more urbanized, and over 50% of the whole world will be urbanized by 2030. That's the prediction. Now, why did urbanization happen in developed countries? Now, there's a couple of reasons in the UK mainly. So, in the UK, between 1830 and 1890, towns grew rapidly by 10% per year and have continued to grow since. So, this just shows a rapid urbanization during that period of time. They still grow now, but not as quickly as that. Now, the main causes of this are agricultural revolution. So, this meant that new technology on farmland meant that fewer workers were needed in rural areas. And you can see this now. One tractor can do huge amounts of work compared to what lots of workers used to do back in the day. So therefore, these jobs are no longer available on the farms, and these people then had to move somewhere else, usually cities, to find work. So therefore, that was one of the major problems. The agricultural revolution forced people to find work in urban areas, as the rural areas didn't need it, as all their jobs became mechanized. Secondly was the Industrial Revolution. Now, huge amounts of jobs became available as new factories are being built, essentially in northern towns, but all over England. And then all the resources needed to fuel it, like coal areas in Wales, so Cardiff, Swansea areas. There was lots of resources available there, and so people started going to those areas, and they urbanized because there's lots more jobs available. Mainly as a result also of England being, the UK being a colonial power, and there's lots of wealth created through that, and all the products are being sent and need to be processed and created. So that's why the factories developed, and therefore lots of people moved to these factories, which have terrible conditions, but it was a strong reason why the UK urbanized so quickly. Therefore, big reason as well. Third is the Enclosures Act. Now, common land which everyone kind of was using at the time to farm and personally use, um, people had to, after this Enclosures Act got passed, essentially, people were evicted from the countryside if they couldn't prove they owned the land, which a lot of people couldn't, which kind of meant that poor people were then taken, removed off land, and then it was privatized essentially, and someone else owned it, which meant they didn't have any assets anymore. They couldn't work the land. They didn't own anything, so therefore they had to move to the city to survive, which forced a lot of poor people in the northern cities, like around Bradford, those kinds of areas, maybe Birmingham, to move to the city. And as a result of these three main reasons, and we'll have a look at maybe a couple more kind of other reasons why the UK in particular urbanised in different areas. But as a result of these three main things, now 82% of the UK live in urban areas, so about 4 out of every 5 people live in urban areas in the UK. Now, the reasons are slightly different in developing and emerging countries. Remember, developing and emerging is the one term we use um, when we're talking about our case studies. Now, rural to urban migration. So this is your push and pull factors. So why people move from the countryside, the rural areas, to urban areas. And then secondly, we've got natural increase. Now, this is kind of a natural way that populations increase. So this means birth rate goes above the death rate. So that could be for a variety of reasons. Now, it could be because of improvements in healthcare, a rise in birth rate because perhaps the people in cities are quite young and tend to be a childbearing age, so they might be having more children. Um, you might have a lowering of death rate because of standard of quality of life has improved in a certain area. Among other things, perhaps there wasn't a bad natural disaster, things like that have affected either the birth rate or the death rate. And you need to be able to explain those reasons. So please go into more depth when you're explaining them. Natural increase, why has that happened? Improvements in healthcare, maybe a lack of contraception, which means the birth rate goes up, or you know, death rates go down, child mortality goes down because less children are dying at a young age due to maybe preventable diseases through dirty water and things like that. Now, these are some of the kind of reasons why people move. Be push and pull factors from rural areas to urban areas. Now, this is, for instance, in Mumbai. We read in the lesson we read the small text on the reasons why people are moving, from the rural areas to the city. India's experiencing massive urbanization. That's why some of the cities are some of the biggest in the world. We're talking 10 million plus. It's just like a mega city is a city over 10 million people. Now, the causes of this in rural areas is perhaps a lack of jobs. Maybe the jobs are low paid, so pushing people away. Quality of life is going down. Maybe young people can't access land, or education is not up to kind of the standards that people want, perhaps, or the living conditions are poor. Not many opportunities, maybe no access to kind of clean water, electricity. And then those are your kind of push factors, so reasons why you want to leave. And then the urban areas, there's a massive tech revolution in India at the moment, so huge amounts of jobs in technology, lots of factories, and urban areas are attractive places to live, especially for young people, because there's universities available, they can access the fun things in life, services, and perhaps a greater opportunity to make a large amount of money through a better job. So these are some of the reasons why there's in Mumbai there's a massive population growth. So people tend to think that their quality of life is going to go up when they go to cities, and they face different challenges, but in general they have better access and more potential to earn a large amount of money, which perhaps is the main motivation, especially if they don't have many kind of life opportunities in the rural areas for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they're living in poverty, perhaps there isn't much land being shared among a large family, and therefore they may struggle to find um, that the quality of life is adequate, and they want to move to urban area because of the poor factors. The education, healthcare, quality of life is better in general. So make sure you're able to explain that. Now here's an example of a question you can kind of get in the exam. So I've given a small piece of information there, in fact, the trend that we talked about earlier. So that in, over 50% of the world's population live in urban areas. But in 1900, this figure was only 13%. So you have to be able to now if you look at the question, we can see it says, explain 2 reasons for the very rapid growth of megacities in developing or emerging countries. Now you need to give 2 examples and explain them. So have a go at writing it. So pause the slideshow and have a go at answering this question. And I've got a kind of little mark scheme how I would kind of what the answer I would give, an example answer I would give. Next slide. So this is an example of a kind of answer I'd give. You could say one reason for the growth and urbanization in megacities is natural increase. This has become healthcare in developing countries has improved, meaning child mortality has decreased, thus meaning the death rate decreases, and therefore you can have a natural increase in population. Another reason is rural to urban migration. This is because there are few jobs in rural areas, and therefore young people move to cities to search for economic opportunities and a better standard of living. Standard of living kind of refers to economic, whereas quality of life is kind of social and economic at the same time. So that would be a way to get 4 marks for this one. Now, as you can see, London and Mumbai's population in this graph, okay, have changed different ways over time. Now, I want you to have a go at firstly comparing the changes between Mumbai and London's population. So using sentences like in 1880, Mumbai's population was this and London's population was this, but by 1930, Mumbai's population had increased slightly to this and London's had increased dramatically to about 8 million. However, by 1980, Mumbai's population has risen to this and London's had slightly decreased, and therefore Mumbai's population was higher. So that's kind of a compare. It's good practice to kind of understand different trends happening in graphs. Now, secondly, this is another kind of practice question you could do. Suggest one reason for the change to Mumbai's population. Now, suggest is kind of give a reasoned explanation. So what could be a reason for the change to Mumbai's population? Now, for 3 marks, you'd have to fully develop that explanation. So have a go at those 2 questions. So pause the slideshow and have a go at it. And now we'll move on. So the next little bit of the presentation is going to look mainly at the UK's population distribution. So urbanisation basically in the UK. That's urbanised. As you can see, in the east of England, there is a massive area where that bump is, where it's a reasonably low urban population. Those are areas that are really good for growth. We've got our 3 factors here. We've got physical factors, historical factors, and economic factors, and you need to be able to kind of explain them all. So for this question now, I want you to explain 3 reasons why the UK population is distributed like this. So you could give a physical example, historical example, and an economic example, and that would be great. So lastly, definitely have a go at all these questions, by the way. And there's a exam question in the yellow box at the bottom there. So these are kind of like a set of impacts of urbanization. Now, these are very generic ones. Obviously, there are case study ones for Mexico City and Birmingham, but these are some kind of general knowledge, really good impacts that are very useful for kind of explaining impacts of urbanization. Now, what you need to do is look at them, read through, try and categorize them into either developed country examples or developing and emerging country examples. And then it's also really good to sort them out into kind of biggest and smallest impact. Um, sorting information multiple times really allows you to think about it, read through it, and decide, and it's more likely to stick into your brain. So, really good example is have a read through and try and sort them out into different impacts. Um, and then this is the kind of correct way to sort them out. Now, we've got obviously in developing countries, the examples are mainly around kind of stresses of overcrowding, unemployment, lack of education, in a sense, and the growth of shanty towns. Now, Mexico City, for example, is a city that's growing at 2,000 people per day. So if you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of people coming every year, it's very difficult to provide those services to people, and therefore those pressures are the main ones, is trigger points. So you can, your classic examples of slums and lack of opportunities in terms of, kind of social opportunities like education or clean living conditions, sanitary living conditions, perhaps. Obviously, these places have a whole range of situations, and you shouldn't just generically say this, but these are some of the impacts. And obviously, one of them is, often people leave rural areas to search for kind of riches in urban areas, and therefore this can leave some areas of developing countries, especially rural areas, with a lack of young people to work the land. And eventually, these areas kind of go into economic decline. Secondly, we've got our developed country examples. We've got our housing costs going up. For instance, in London between 1996 and 2016, kind of there's an average jump of about 488% in some areas. So it's a huge amount of pressure being put on young people, especially to try and buy houses. So that's one of the problems. Secondly is transport. Especially in London, we've got masses of problems, especially at rush hour. If trains break down and things like that, there's problems with transport. Causes a lot of problems, perhaps, and lots of people have to wait for different methods of public transport, and they're constantly, trying to improve it and create. They're now creating the crossrails to try and handle some of the kind of volume of people, the amount of people coming through. So that's one pressure as well. And then education as well. Lots of areas are struggling to provide enough school places for the families that are moving in, and changes in population. For instance, one school in East London has got 500 pupils, trying to go for 180 places in one year group in year 7. That's an example of the massive pressure being put on these schools in these urban areas, especially in developed countries. So London is the kind of example I've used here, but this is kind of something that may be apparent in other places as well. So obviously it's all about urbanisation puts pressure on kind of services available, especially housing, transport, education, in both senses, in both developed countries and developing and emerging countries. However, we've got more drastic pressures in developing and emerging countries, because the process of urbanization is so rapid that they may struggle really to provide the services that people need, adequate housing and things like that. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it's going to help your revision and give you some kind of basis of knowledge for the exam. And any questions, just post them on the comments. Thank you.